Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dalhousie Faculty of Medicine's podcast, Leadership PRN. This podcast is intended for anyone interested in effective medical leadership, whether in the clinical setting or the academic center. I'm your host, Dr. Lara Hazelton. I practice general psychiatry and work part-time in continuing professional development at the medical school, where our faculty development team creates programs to support faculty in their roles as teachers, scholars, and leaders. Today, I'm very pleased to have with me Dr. Varun Dev. Varun, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So thanks for having me, first of all. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a nephrologist in Toronto at Humber River Hospital. It's a large urban community hospital in the city. I'm from Toronto originally, did my fellowship at Western University. Got an interest in leadership earlier on, which, we can discuss later. And so I'm a nephrologist there. I also have various leadership roles. I'm the medical lead of one of our satellite sites, basically. We have our home dialysis unit there. We have all of our clinics there. We have an inpatient unit there, and we also have an outpatient dialysis center there. So that's been a lot of learning and experience for me, certainly. I'm also on the board of directors of the Ontario Association of Nephrology. And I do a lot of work in leadership education with respect to creating curriculums, at the national level, at, local levels for various programs in different universities. And I also have given talks at various programs as well about what it's like to be an emerging leader. And sort of on the side, a newer interest has been getting involved in the health technology entrepreneurship space, both as a consultant, advisor, and investor most recently.
And Varun, you have some background, some education that's relevant to leadership and administration.
Oh, that's right. After my fellowship, I did a master's in health administration at the University of Toronto as well to help bolster my experience and knowledge, really.
So that I find that interesting when people choose to do some further education while they're still either in training or recently graduated. Can you tell us a bit about what it was that first drew your interest towards leadership and administration at such an early stage in your career?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was really a sort of indirect path that led there. I remember a few really key moments earlier on in my residency that really directed me towards leadership. So the first was, I was an internal medicine resident at Western, and I was doing one of my early stages of senior medical call, overnight in the Emerge. And this is when you're running a team of junior residents and medical students. You're kind of in charge of the whole thing. You're getting 50 to 20 consults a night, and it's quite an undertaking. So, of course, after a very busy night, of no sleep or anything like that, we'd admitted about 20 patients, all of them quite sick. I was completely exhausted. But I thought I had done a good job, and I was pretty proud of myself, and I was, looking forward to going home and giving myself a pat on the back. And I had gotten an email from one of the administrators essentially chastising me for not having seen the patients quickly enough in the emergency department because they were trying to achieve certain wait times. And that really rubbed me the wrong way, particularly at that moment in time, being very underslept. And, what it really made me aware of is that physicians practice within a system, and there are certain constraints within that system, whether it's human resources, whether it's financial constraints, whether it's an organization that has a strategy that they're trying to implement. There's a whole big system that physicians work within, and we're not sort of free willy-nilly to do what we want. And being cognizant that, hey, there's a bigger game at play, sort of initially turned my focus towards it. And there were a bunch of other experiences sort of similar to that along the way, where as a physician, I wanted to do X, Y, and Z, but there were administrative or organizational constraints that really impacted how I practiced. So I very early on realized that if I want to be an effective physician, I can't just focus on the clinical side of it. I have to be aware of the environment that I'm working in and realizing that I'm going to be influenced by that environment. How can I get involved in that environment so I can influence, how physicians practice and how I'm able to practice? So that's what kind of turned me on to that whole aspect of medicine. And the more senior I got, particularly in fellowship, particularly with nephrology care, it is a very rapidly expanding field. Everyone has diabetes. Lots of people have high blood pressure. The CKD population is growing. It's also a very, expensive treatment. Dialysis is very burdensome, for the province and nationally. So realizing that nephrology was really intersecting, with that environment really tuned me towards it. And luckily I had a couple of great mentors who were heavily involved in leadership during my fellowship, and they kind of encouraged me that although at the time I was pursuing it, it was very unpopular. They kind of encouraged me to go for it, and they were right in saying that in the next 5 to 10 years, this is going to be a really big focus for young physicians going forward.
So that's interesting. So your mentors encouraged you to do another degree, is that right?
Yeah, well, not necessarily another degree, but they said, you wouldn't be wasting your time if you did an additional training, right? And so that was something, again, in residency, you don't get taught anything, right? You don't get taught about strategy, you don't get taught about change management or anything like that. And so my exposure was extremely minimal. And I realized, hey, if you're gonna really focus on this in the future, your knowledge base is going to need to increase. And so just learning what emotional intelligence was, learning what change management was, were kind of the basic building blocks that I needed. And that's exactly what the master's program was able to provide.
When you look back at it now, do you think there would have been a way to get it in the residency, or do you think you kind of needed the additional training and focus and time of a master's?
I think residency is an optimal place to have that type of training because you're in the mix, right? Certainly the fellowship programs or the residency programs need to provide formal education in that. I think it's really hard for a resident to teach themselves about all those things, to kind of go on their own time and learn about those things if it's not formalized. But I think the other challenge is I would say twofold. Maturity is sort of one thing. For a large portion of residency people, there are some older residents, of course, that have done lots of other additional training and education prior, but majority are fairly young. And I think to get into the emotional intelligence, to get into that framework of leadership, maturity helps. And certainly I've realized that as I've gone through my career, my approach when I was a second-year resident, responding to that email I got from the administrator, would be completely different to my approach that I would handle it now. So I think, learning more about the system and having more mature perspectives helps. So that would be one challenge in residency. But the other is just time. Residency, you're overwhelmed with just being a good clinician. Right? You're trying to learn your craft. You're trying to decide what fellowship program you're going to go into. You're trying to pass an exam. You're trying to pass a rotation. So, just balancing that aspect is difficult. Adding on that whole other component of leadership might just be a lot to process at that time. That being said, the earlier you introduce someone to an idea, the better, right? Even though it may not sink in residency, hearing it again in fellowship, then hearing it again once you're staff, I think it would be beneficial, but programs would have to formalize that training.
Mm. And I suppose you had access to people with expertise by doing a master's degree that you probably wouldn't have ever had as a resident.
Absolutely. We had CEOs, chief technology officers of hospitals, chief innovation officers of hospitals come and give their perspective. So that was, invaluable. The biggest thing that was of value to me was that my master's course was not for physicians specifically. Out of, 60 or 70 of us, 2 or 3 were physicians. And I think that was really the key learning for me. If you're going to be a leader in the healthcare system, physicians are a very small group, that you're going to be leading. There's going to be nurses, there's going to be managers, there's going to be VPs, there's going to be a whole other slew of personnel that you are not introduced to in residency that you're going to have to work with. So being able to understand their motivations, being able to understand their fears, what are they concerned about? What are their priorities? You cannot be an effective leader unless you understand the people that you're leading. And I think that was the biggest benefit, of being in that type of program. Certainly, yes, the formal learning about change management, emotional intelligence was helpful. But, there are books you can get. There are, other ways to get that type of education. But really the education between the lines was interacting with all of the people who are various players throughout the system and getting their perspectives. When I was doing my master's, it was when the OMA was undergoing negotiations, those tense negotiations with physicians. So, physicians, their role in healthcare, their compensation in healthcare was a huge talking point throughout the 2 years of the master's. So, it really informed me how other people in the system perceived physicians, right? And I think that is a crucial piece of information that I was able to gain and understand how we are viewed, right? And that helped me I think be a much more effective leader going forward.
So that sort of interdisciplinary, interprofessional perspective.
Absolutely, because you don't get that in residency, right? You don't, as a resident, you're not interacting with managers very much. You're not interacting with VPs or anything like that. And when you try to be a leader as a staff, those are the people you're emailing 20 times a day, right? So it took me a while to understand what their roles are. What is our organizational structure? Who reports to who? Like, you have to understand those relationships if you're going to try to make any change, in an organization. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges once you're starting off, is just navigating the environment and understanding who's who. Like, who can help me get this done and who could be an obstacle for me getting this done. And so that is what I say to a lot of the younger learners, because there's a lot of leadership education programs that are all residents or all physicians. And I say that's great, but you're all just going to be saying the same thing, and you're all going to agree with each other, and you're all going to pat yourselves on the back and go away, but you still won't know how to deal with 90% of the people you're going to be interacting with. Right? So I think that was the huge value for me. If you are going to do additional education, which I think is important, if you really are into leadership and you really want to focus on it, additional training, whether it's a certificate course, a master's program, an MBA, or anything like that, make sure to train with non-physicians. Of course, train with physicians as well, but make sure to have a significant component where you're in an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar people.
I think that your training, if I understand, one of the things that really drew you was quality improvement. Do you want to speak a little bit about what it is about quality improvement that you see as such an important part of our healthcare leadership?
Absolutely. I think quality improvement is a smaller bucket that I would put under a bigger leadership umbrella. And I think quality improvement really gives you specific tools, like quantitative tools, that you can use when trying to make change as a leader. All right. So quality improvement, what I learned in doing quality improvement and doing leadership courses, is that quality improvement without emotional intelligence is essentially useless. Quality improvement without understanding how it fits into change management is not going to be useful. And I see this with residents and medical students who are doing quality improvement projects. They're so focused on their methodology, on their quantitative analysis, they kind of lose the big picture, right? So I think it's a very important skill set to have. And I think that's how you can demonstrate that you've made a successful change. That's how you can track whether your interventions are actually having the impact that you want. But if you just have that, you're missing the big picture, I think. And that was a huge thing for me to learn. I was doing my master's in health administration at the same time that I was doing I was auditing a master's in quality improvement as well. So I didn't have the official master's in quality improvement, but I was lucky enough to be able to attend, 99% of the classes. And I saw that connection between them. They're absolutely related, but one without the other, becomes much more difficult to be impactful. So I think it's absolutely essential to have that skill set, but just having it, you're going to be left short.
That's interesting. So emotional intelligence, talk a bit more about that, so how emotional intelligence is essential for quality.
Yeah, I think, what I've learned even generally, you could zoom out to say as a physician, it's important, or even as a person in society, it's important. But being able to have effective relationships with people, being able to understand what motivates other people, being able to understand what motivates you, what your blind sights are. When does my pride get in the way? When does my ego as, I'm a physician and I know everything, get in the way of me, making improvements? And how does that get in the way of people wanting to work with me, right? How do you kind of facilitate large scale change with people? Of course, you need a good change management strategy. Of course, you need the quality improvement metrics. But what I think is kind of the grease or the oil that really gets things spinning is that emotional intelligence. And it's really, there's books written about it. So I encourage anyone, if you want to read more, there's books and books. But it's really about relationships with people, I find. And it's really about checking yourself. It's, what are my assumptions? How is my ego getting in the way? What are my, preconceptions about this person? How is that getting in the way of us going forward? And so, you start to think about emotional intelligence, about your relationship with other people, and very quickly it just turns into an inside reflection about, how am I contributing to the, unsuccess of this, or how am I contributing to the success of this? And that's a lifelong journey. Introspection and, improving oneself is really a lifelong thing. And that's why I say that's the biggest blind spot I see with people, and particularly myself, is you can have the greatest strategy, be the most confident speaker, but if people don't buy into you, right, there's some intangible aspect. If people don't trust you, if people don't buy into you, if they don't feel valued by you, they're not going to run with you. And being able to make people feel valued often is a reflection of how you feel about yourself and how you're dealing with your own issues. And so I think it's an interesting thing to get into. And once you get into it, there's no leaving it. So like once you start on, it's a one-way journey, basically. And so I think the more I've gone into these formal aspects of leadership, the more everything kind of just traces back to emotional intelligence, at least for me, personally, right? And the people who I've seen who are incredible leaders, who are incredible clinicians, people who I want to follow or people who I'm inspired by, all have that aspect of, really making you feel good about yourself, really taking your input, making you feel valued. Whether they, value you or not, whether they're really listening to you or not, they're able to make it seem genuine, right? And really the only way that's going to come off sincerely is if you really, feel that inside. And so everything I do just always keeps on coming back to that. And that's what I think is a big challenge, because it's really about, what are my blind spots? Okay, it's one thing to identify the blind spots, but then it's how do I change that? Like this behavior that I've been doing for 20 years or 25 years, how do I kind of re-engineer that or re-engineer my thought pattern to not give out those negative signals, that I wasn't even aware that I was giving out, for example.
Do you think feedback is one of the ways that you're able to do that? Are there people you turn to for feedback?
Absolutely. So one of the great things about the masters is we did these things that I had never heard of. It was called 360 feedback. And so it was largely a group-based master. So we were given kind of cases or challenges or projects, and you're in a group of 6 people you've never met before. You're all in healthcare, but in completely different aspects of healthcare. Everyone has their own preconceived notions about each other, and you're forced to kind of solve a problem by yourself. And everyone wants to show what they know and everything like that. So you get a lot of clashing, basically. And through that, you come to a resolution. And after those projects, each kind of group member openly, like in a written document, feeds back about each of the other group members. And who's evaluating you. And people were really genuine about it. No one was trying to be mean or anything like that. But you get a really good insight into how you come off. And it was shocking to me that all through our residency, we never did that, right? You get feedback from staff, and usually staff tend to be on the nicer end because the more critical they are, the more work that results from that. Right, there's that whole fear of failure type of aspect there. But in this, people were fairly brutally honest, right? And these are people you've been working with for 6 months, so you had, you developed a relationship with them by that point. So it wasn't just someone kind of bashing you. But when you start to see themes over and over again, 5 or 6 or 7 people whom you trust at this point, who you think are valuable people whose insights you value, when you start hearing the same things over and over again, it really makes you look inwards and say, oh, maybe that's right. Maybe I do need to work on how I project or how I come off or whatnot. So the feedback absolutely, I think, is crucial, but you need feedback from people whose feedback you will value and whose feedback you will trust, right? Because some people might just bash you for no reason, and some people might just, say everything nice about you because they really have nothing invested in your success or anything like that. But I found those experiences really valuable.
Yeah, that's similar to the research on feedback for learners around in medical education, that if they're going to trust and hear the feedback, they have to really feel that the person has their best interests in heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a helpful part, particularly the people, like initially, there were people who had, conflict was normal, right? You're challenging each other. Everyone has different experiences and different ideas. And it was the people who I kind of butted heads with the most, who at the end, whose feedback I ended up valuing the most, and whose feedback was actually the most insightful, right? The people who agree with you, they're going to say, yes, this guy's great, but the people who disagree with you may have more insight and may be able to give you more of an opportunity to reflect on, why they disagreed with you, and do they have a valid point for why they were rubbed the wrong way, for example.
They may understand you better.
Exactly.
Having made the effort to disagree with you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you're about 5 years out of residency and fellowship training, I guess, now. And one of the things I thought might be interesting for our listeners is to hear the perspective of someone like yourself who knew in residency you were interested in leadership, did some further education, and then made the transition to being in practice and has sought out some leadership roles. And has it gone the way you expected? What might you advice give to yourself when you were still in training?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure what my expectations were, but certainly it's been challenging, which I guess was part of the expectation. I think the biggest challenge when trying to be a leader, particularly I would say an emerging leader or a young staff leader, is you're still trying to get your craft, you're still trying to get comfortable with being a solo, practitioner without any supervisor, without anything like that. So that's part of the challenge is, 80 to 90% of your bandwidth is trying to say, okay, how can I be the best clinician that I can be? How can I hone my craft at, as a physician first? So that occupies so much of your time, and it's pretty anxiety inducing. I don't know anyone in their first 3 or 4 years of practice who didn't have significant amount of stress, when you were transitioning from a supervised role as a fellow to a completely unsupervised role. So that was certainly, and also just learning the ins and outs of the hospital and the program that I was in. The learning curve was very, very steep for that clinically. So that was much more challenging than I had expected. So that was number one. Number two, in terms of the leadership, it was really navigating the socio-political environment of the hospital. And each hospital, each organization, each division, each department has its own, micro socio-political environment that you have to learn and understand to then be effective in. And so Humber is a really, really big hospital. There are a lot of hierarchies and layers. It's also a very old hospital, so there's lots of, vestigial politics from decades past that still kind of frame how things are done. So just understanding the landscape took me a lot longer than I initially thought it would. And I learned it by failing, miserably over and over again, saying, why isn't this working? Like, why aren't I getting traction here? And it's like, oh, because, this person has a decade-long conflict with this person and they don't want to work together, right? Nothing to do with really the mechanics of the change, but more so who's involved, right? And so learning about all of those relationships, all of those hierarchies, and the environment of the hospital was probably the biggest challenge. And that took me years, particularly, the pandemic happened in the middle of all of that. So it was difficult, but it was also, I think, accelerated me in really learning about the organization, right? Seeing the organization and the leadership under duress, because it was a very stressful time, how they reacted to challenges kind of revealed to me a lot of the underpinnings of the organization that I think would have taken me a lot longer to understand. Similarly, our program went through a lot of transition in terms of our leadership personnel. That was a time when a lot of people were, leaving jobs, and even now retaining talent has been a challenge. So all of those, non-leadership related things, none of it was about change management, right? None of it was about any of that. It was all just about the structure that you're working in. So realizing the importance of all of that was a huge learning curve for me. And then trying to understand that environment was a huge learning curve for me. At this point now, I think I'm learning how to be much more effective in terms of my leadership role. I know which things are going to go somewhere, and I know which things will kind of fall flat on the spot and I shouldn't even bother with. And I think knowing which battles to pick is really the first step, right? Understanding what's going to resonate not only with your colleagues, but what's going to resonate with your kind of department or division. So like, will the nurses be on board with this project or not? Do they care about this project or not? Does the administrative clerks care about this project or not? Like really at every level, who is going to care? And if they do, will they put in effort to support a change, right? And then at each level, same analysis has to be done, right? At the organization, does this line up with our department strategy? Does this line up with the strategic priorities of the organization? And kind of understanding all the factors that need to line up before even starting is the main challenge, right? I would come in and say, oh, I've got a great idea about how to fix this, right? Starting with the solution, right? Which is the exact backwards way that you should be doing it. So now I kind of say, does everyone agree that this is a problem, right? Before even thinking about what the solution is. And then I don't even propose a solution. I say, what does everyone else think the solution is, right? What would work for everyone else? And then you slowly try to build a solution and try to build a consensus where everyone feels like their input, has been taken into consideration. Because ultimately, if you don't take into account their input, you're going to find out later on in the process that it doesn't work for someone, basically. So to me, that's been really the big challenge, is understanding the environment and particularly who you're working with, right? Like what's going to work with the nephrologist at Humber River is not going to work with the nephrologist at Sunnybrook Hospital, for example, right? Like it's really about who are you working with? Like, so in my division, there's 9 of us, and I think 6 or 7 are, male and over the age of 60 or 65, right? So, things may not resonate with them as it would if there was a younger group around me, for example, right? So and that's the setup. So you unfortunately have to play to that, right? And so just understanding the environment has been the biggest challenge and the biggest oversight on my part.
So as we're wrapping up here, do you have any advice then to our listeners who might be either finishing training, transitioning to practice, or early career leaders?
Absolutely. So this is what I spend sort of the most time thinking about now, is having gone through those initial kind of 5 years, having had a lot of experience in a hospital or, in a department or division trying to make change. What I've realized is that being an emerging physician leader is a role of opportunity. So there's really limitless things that you can do. So if you want to be sort of within an organization or within your hospital, you can think about whether you want to be a teacher, for example, a researcher. You can take on all these different roles. There are also many roles that I'm getting involved in now that are outside the hospital, that are outside of my division, outside of my department, outside of Humber River, outside of the Royal College, outside of all these kind of formal organizations. There is a digital revolution that is going to happen in healthcare, right? We're seeing it in every other industry, and it's for sure going to happen in healthcare. I still fax prescriptions to pharmacies. Okay, so the bar is very low for innovation. And I think young leaders today are much more well-versed in technology than maybe perhaps, their senior counterparts who may be 60 or 70 years old. We're the iPhone generation, the social media generation. And I think there's going to be a huge amount of innovation in the healthcare technology space. And I think that's a really exciting place for young physician leaders to have an impact. You can have a massive impact on a very quick time scale, much faster and much bigger than at least I perceive I will be able to have in a hospital, right? I think change in a hospital is hard. I think it takes a long time to make significant impacts in the hospital because hospitals, are not meant to be particularly innovative, nimble organizations, right? They're big ships that need to stay afloat. So I think personally that health technology space, that entrepreneurship space, that's why I do a lot of consulting or advising or investing. There's a lot to be had in that space. And I think that's really going to shape the future of healthcare. And so if you really want to lead and if you really want to have an impact, I would encourage young physician leaders to take a look at that space and see how they can get involved.
So thanks so much for speaking with us today, Varun. It's very exciting to hear somebody at the beginning of their career with so much passion and so much insight about leadership. So thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks.
And thanks to everybody for listening to this episode of Leadership PRN. If you have ideas for future episodes, please feel free to reach out to me at lara.hazelton@dal.ca or lara.hazelton@nshealth.ca. And until next time, take care.